Welcome back. This is week 13, lecture 1, Reaganism and the New Individualism. And this lecture is getting towards the end of the course. We have 2 weeks left and then the final exam. So there's this lecture, the following lecture of this week, and then 2 lectures next week. And then on week 15, as you'll see, or should know already on the syllabus, is simply 1 lecture preparing for the final exam. So you're getting there. You should also notice that the reading has lessened. Chapter 30 of your textbook is assigned for this week. And that's then the end of the textbook. And then there are some documents for next week's reading. So we're getting there. So just hang in there. And the lectures, too, will be shorter. I know I promised that last week, and both lectures were way over my quote-unquote allotted time, but that will be made up for this week. I'm 99% sure. Anyway, we'll see how it goes. But this lecture then is part of this whole series in terms of the post-war mess that began with the lecture before the second midterm, and just is continuing in terms of how the attempts to deal with the reconstruction in some ways of the global order after the Second World War are essential to understanding where we are in the world today. That's where this is all about. So it's somewhat chronological, but yet also thematic. And so all of these kind of lectures go together and help you can put it all together in one picture for understanding the development of Western civilization in the final as we go through that. Now, that being said, as I'll be talking about later, the period of the 1970s on into the 1980s, especially in the 80s, has been referred to as the era of Ronald Reagan. I'll be talking about the 70s shortly. Whereas last week we talked about the 60s, and then how the 60s was more than simply from January 1st, 1960 to December 31st, 1969. The same way with kind of the Reagan period, even though, as I will be getting to, the 70s, as I will be talking about in the first slide, are really essential for understanding how Reagan came to power. I mean, obviously, in the election of 1980. And the kind of almost the reaction, Reaganism was almost the reaction to the 70s. Now, the new individualism was a real shift. It's always been basically the case that Americans in their ideology are and have been idealistic, or not idealistic, that too, but individualistic. Focusing on the rights of the individual. But what happens, I think, can be very well illustrated by comparing 2 quotations. The first is from John F. Kennedy, who famously said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what can you do for your country?" That puts it in this context of the common good. Whereas the individuality and individualism was to be within the context of the common good of the country. Reagan ran his campaign based on the motto, "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?" Focusing on the individual. I think I ended with this in the last lecture. Focusing on, you. Are you better off? You should vote based on your own self and your own interests, not what you think is best for the country. Yeah. That's a big difference. An emphasis and focus and the effects of that new individualism, as I'm calling it, we will see as we go through. And in some ways that started some of the developments that are still with us today. So that's being said, we need to look at and begin with the kind of background to the emergence of Ronald Reagan and the new individualism. And that brings us to the first slide, which is the 70s. with the subtitle "The '60s quote unquote hangover." In so many ways, I'm assuming most of you know what a hangover is. In so many ways, the 1970s were just that, a hangover of the 1960s, which I've already been talked about. It was not a great decade in so many ways. It's a decade I kind of grew up in basically. So it was a period of economic problems within the United States. It was a problem of global tensions, but not to the same extent as there had been in the 60s with the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Cold War and the almost revolutionary movements of 1968 on a global scale, not just within the United States. And all of this tension of the 1960s kind of settled down in the 1970s as really kind of a blander, blah-er view of just a continuation, except the wealth and the prosperity, the economic problems got more severe. Now, there's also political problems and issues. But just in terms of going through some of the economic issues, I have up there stagflation. Now, stagflation, that was coined to describe what was going on in the 70s, the term, and I have up there the different rates. I have this inflation combined with unemployment increases. Between 1900 and 1970, the average inflation over that period, 70-year period, it doesn't mean that there weren't fluctuations. There certainly were, but the average inflation was 2.5%. Between 1970 and 1979, the average inflation was 7.06%. We talk about inflation being a problem now. Or, of course, it's come down significantly. But it was far higher in the 70s as an average. And the height of inflation in the 70s was in December of 1979 when inflation was 13.29%. And that is a real problem, an issue, especially when unemployment is increasing. And so there's basically very little means to help the economy get out of the doldrums, so to speak. We have interest rates that were extremely high as well. The average interest rates in terms of the prime rate in the 70s was 12%, with the high in December of 1980 of 21.5%. So if you've been paying attention at all to what has been going on in the political discussion in the world today, you know that these are issues of importance today and the impact that they have on the political climate and everything else. But they were in the 70s as well as perhaps never before, at least since the Great Depression. They call it the Great Recession in many ways. So that's what was really going on. It was a struggle. People were hurting and suffering. And that also then was combined with the oil crisis. OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, was founded in 1960. These are basically Arab countries, predominantly Islamic countries, if not exclusively so. And they issued an oil embargo. This was in response to the Yom Kippur War, which I talked about last lecture. And they increased the oil price of crude oil 70% as a response. Yes, they had also then invaded Egypt and Syria and Jordan. But they also attacked, so to speak, and opposed the West by trying to make the oil prices so high that the West would be needing oil and wouldn't have it available to conduct operations. Now, that was also part of the continued tensions. I talked about the wars in the Middle East in the 60s, the 7-Day War and then the Yom Kippur War. But that also was a problem for the U.S., who was always backing Israel. In 1972, so right before the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War, we have the Munich Massacre. in the Summer Olympics at Munich, where Palestinians, terrorists group called the Black September, kidnapped and killed 11 Israeli athletes. That certainly did not help matters or attempts to solve the problem in terms of the 70s. And then in August 9th, 1974, we have the new president since 68, then reelected in 72, Richard Nixon, resigns from office under scandal and indictment, or threatened indictment. Watergate. And Watergate was a major scandal and problem that had not at least come out into the open in the U.S. I mean, I'm not saying that there was no, let's say, corrupt presidents before Richard Nixon. He was generally seen as a strong president up until that time. But he was really paranoid, and he planned and orchestrated the breaking into the Watergate Hotel, which was the headquarters of the Democratic National Convention. The problem was he kept tapes of his Oval Office discussions. When the news about the break-in at the Watergate Hotel surfaced, both Republicans and Democrats investigated because this was seen as an outrage. Nixon addressed the country in trying to keep this, tamp down the problems and issues, and said, "I am not a crook." Famous line, "I am not a crook." But Nixon had this view, which he also articulated explicitly, of the executive power of the office of the presidency, when he said that if a president does something, it is not illegal by definition. That was his attempt to respond to the reports that were coming out. A committee on impeachment, an investigation committee for impeachment, was formed in the House of Representatives bipartisanly. There was certainly opposition of the Republicans defending Nixon against the Democrats. But then they felt that when they found out about the tapes, that they really needed these tapes for the investigation. They had been drawing up articles of impeachment, and I hope you all know that impeachment is an indictment. It is an indictment in Congress of a president. You can also justices, federal court justices, Supreme Court justices can be impeached. Cabinet members can be impeached. It's not a criminal trial. It is an indictment of Congress, of government officials, to remove them from office. That's what it's about. And so there has to be formulated articles of impeachment, which is the basis of the case, and the House of Representatives does that and votes on that. And then the trial is in the Senate. Now, you should probably know all this because it's been so much on television, with former President Trump having been impeached twice and acquitted both times. And now the Republicans have been trying to impeach President Biden. They've been, or did impeach Secretary Mayorkas, Homeland Security Secretary. And so it's almost become a political tool. Well, it's really not meant to be a political tool. It's meant to be, and had always been meant to be, to effectively remove a person in office from office when it was deemed necessary on criminal bases, high crimes and misdemeanors, not just on policy, but high crimes and misdemeanors. That was the standard. And then the trial in the Senate, that's a constitutional way for dealing with problems. And so Nixon, he was not impeached, but the impeachment inquiry was moving forward, and they felt that they really needed to have access to these tapes dealing with the planning of Watergate, which became known as simply Watergate. Nixon resisted. He said, "I'm not going to turn those over. I don't have to turn those over whatsoever." Well, the case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, "No, you must turn over the tapes." It's a subpoena from a legitimate oversight committee of Congress. You're legally bound to. When that decision came down, Nixon realized, basically, my goose is cooked. And rather than face impeachment and then trial, he resigns in August 1974. Now, this was a major controversy and trauma for the country. Even with the trauma of what was still going on in the Middle East and the economic, the economic problems, the oil embargo, and I didn't even mention this, but the widespread gas rationing. Of course, prices were pretty low because of this, but it got to be so bad that you'd have to maybe you have to wait in line around the block to get to the gas station, and then they started things such as based on your license plate, you could only get gas on Mondays and Wednesdays or Tuesdays and Thursdays. So there was a real rationing of gas in light of the OPEC, let's say, attack or countering of what was going on in the Middle East. So it was not a peaceful time, and Watergate just made that even worse. And then Nixon's vice president, Gerald Ford, when Nixon resigns, becomes president, and then he pardons Nixon. Now, political tensions were rising because of all of this. And when the Republicans heard about the tapes, and when the Supreme Court said they must be turned over, and they were like, no, this is not going to work. And they basically were one together with the Democrats saying, President Nixon, you are going to be impeached. We're not going to put up with this kind of criminal activity of the President of the United States. So it was a bipartisan approach, and that's what led to Nixon's resigning. Ford was not one of the most outstanding presidents or strongest of leaders. He did, though, survive 2 assassination attempts in 1975. We talked about the assassinations of the 1960s. And all of a sudden, too, it's like, what? This is not the way to have a country where if you don't like the president, you just assassinate them. Who is behind it? What's going on? Are these individuals? Or is there some group behind it? And there's also always the issue of, is it the Soviets? Because this Cold War is still going on as a problem. In 1976, Jimmy Carter is elected president from Georgia. And he kind of inherited both a domestic and an international situation of problems. Serious problems. And he was the president who had to oversee the Iran hostage situation. He's still dealing with the Cold War aspects and all the turmoil, again, in the aftermath of the 60s. And here we have then the confrontation with the USSR, because Leonid Brezhnev was the leader of the USSR and felt that he could and should assert Soviet influence and power. At the same time, he initiates a policy of détente, as it became known, French word, because the origins of it in terms of referring to politics goes back to the 19th century in French. But it was a way to say we should ease tensions. We don't want to have nuclear war. So on the one hand, there was this policy of Brezhnev of détente. Let's discuss relationships. Let's work things out diplomatically. Let's not have that threat of blowing each other up and blowing the entire world up. So that was the détente. Even as his policy, which became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine, was to limit any foreign influence in Soviet affairs internally within the Soviet Union or within any of the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. And Carter came into conflict with Brezhnev because Carter was speaking out against the Soviets over the issues of human rights. And Brezhnev was to stay out of it. And so there was this tension that was there even under the context of détente. They're the nuclear arms reductions agreements, because during this period, in the context of détente, the Soviets and the U.S., so that we can talk about things, we can make things better. So let's make things better. Let's work things out. And one way to avoid all-out nuclear war is to say, let's reduce our nuclear weapons. So there was a real progress being made on that level in terms of easing tensions and alleviating further potential threats of global nuclear war. And yet this Brezhnev doctrine of limiting any outside interference led to the USSR invading Afghanistan in 1979. So that at that point, the period of détente was over. And in response, the U.S. boycotts the 1980 Moscow Olympics. So here we have, at the end of the 70s, renewed tensions and conflict with the Soviet Union, which is following the Brezhnev doctrine. Economic problems, again, up there with the inflation and interest rates hitting their highs in 79 and early 80. And that led to, both in the U.S. and in the U.K., a conservative reaction, saying we have to stop this. This attempt to appease the Soviets needs to be changed. We need to be more aggressive in opposing Soviet influence and aggression, and we need to somehow fix our economy because it's not working. And in 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected president of the U.S. And Ronald Reagan, campaigning on that doctrine, are you better off than you were 4 years ago, which clearly within the economic situation of the 70s was no, we're not. He was elected. Now, Reagan was, as you probably know, a Hollywood actor. He was a movie actor. And this is really the first movie actor that turned politician. And almost turned politics. I mean, politics had always been a popularity contest, so to speak, contest. But somehow with Reagan, he brought his Hollywood experience to it. And that led to the real change and shift in American policy. And we have up here then Reagan and Reaganomics. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And what Reagan brought in was this conservative shift of the West under Reagan and Thatcher that had been more against what was going on in the 70s, which was a more, let's say, democratic and more liberal approach to the economy and to society, and on we go. The platform, so to speak, was a very strongly counter the USSR. Instead of the nuclear reductions, the U.S. started to engage in what became known as the arms race, to build up the American military capabilities, to kind of counter force with even greater force. And the idea was the threat could bring peace. The threat of nuclear annihilation could bring peace. So we could not let the Soviets even have the inkling that maybe they had the opportunity to get the jump on us and to, get rid of us before we got rid of them. So it was called the arms race. This is talking about the space race. I mentioned it in the lectures, but that was also going on in the 60s. The space race, who could get to space first, and the Soviets got to space, manned space flight first with Sputnik, and then the Apollo missions. Kind of the U.S. won the space race in that sense. But it was this real issue of how can we deal with this conflict with the Soviets. It was also then very pro-business and pro-corporations, and let's cut taxes. Reagan issued in one of the biggest tax cuts in the history of the U.S., and this was based on what was called supply-side economics and the trickle-down effect. Now, the economic policy is going all the way back to FDR and the New Deal was based on Keynesian, John Maynard Keynes, his economic policies, and it was referred to as demand side economics. Because what the issue is, when you have a staggering economy or depressed economy in the Depression, coming out of the Depression. So how do you get it going again? And Keynes's position, and FDR is following it, is you need to, it's called priming the pump. You need to insert more spending into the economy, because if government will spend, that will create more people buying, and that will increase the overall prosperity. And so even with deficit spending, so that will increase the deficit, because that will help the overall economy, which then, if the overall economy is growing and expanding, that will be able to take care of the deficit problem, which obviously has never happened on that level. But it worked in terms of getting out of the Great Depression, going into World War II, and that priming the pump and the whole New Deal aspect. And that was the basic model going in and out through the 70s. And yet it was seemingly this is no longer working. So this supply side theory, based on what became known as the Laffer curve, developed by, I forget his first name, but Laffer at the University of Southern California, my alma mater, where I was there in this time, argued that no, it should be based on supply. We don't try to increase demand, we need to increase supply, because that will itself bring about the demand. So the problem is we need to help production. We need to help production. And this in some ways was based too on the new arms race. We need to help production. And if we cut taxes for corporations and the wealthy, that will make it be a very business-oriented, production, supply-side-oriented economy. So if we can stimulate rather than priming the pump, by pumping money into the economy, we will have tax cuts to encourage businesses and corporations and the wealthy to then invest in the economy. It was called the trickle-down effect. The idea was that if we can increase the economic situation and the wealth and the profits of the corporations and the top crust, that will have a trickle-down effect throughout the economy to all levels. The companies will invest and hire more jobs, so that will help with unemployment because it'll expand production. It will then lead to more investment in social programs of the companies, and it will be just a nice way all the way around. The problem was the trickle-down effect never really took place. It still hasn't. When we have tax cuts to the wealthy, to major corporations, what they do is like, no, that's the way we can get more money for ourselves. We increase our profits. So we're not going to use this benefit, this windfall, to help the economy, because we're going to be focused on ourselves. This whole idea of Reagan, which I'll be getting back to, of how can we increase ourselves? How can we make our things better for ourselves? So the supply side economics and the trickle down effect did not work the way it was intended theoretically, because of the position of corporations and the wealthy of, no, we're not going to try to stimulate the economy by investment. We are going to try to continually increase our profits for ourselves. So that was what this conservative shift was about. And Reagan pursued this policy economically, as did Thatcher in Britain. And so it's kind of like the whole Western world was shifting towards a very different approach than what was called the welfare economy coming out of the New Deal. There was not so much this support for society and welfare, but let's stimulate business and production and wealth, because if we can increase the aggregate wealth, we can increase the overall wealth. And how do you do that? By supporting the wealthy, corporations and individuals, not by trying to bring up the poor, especially in light of the competition with the Soviet Union, which was very much a managed economy from the top down. This is like, no, we are, and also with the whole communist approach, we are going to take the opposite approach as a means of countering the Soviet socialistic communistic approach. So this then was a conscious economic policy to counter the influence and the spheres of influence of the Soviet Union. Also part of that was a reforming of immigration. with Reagan, because Reagan really was very much saying we need to rebuild America. We need to put America first. And he initiated, or his administration initiated, what became known as the Immigration Reform Act of 1968. It's still the last reform of immigration that there has been. There hasn't been a new immigration bill or new immigration law since 1986, and that too is a problem that we're still facing, as I'm assuming that all of you know if you pay any attention to politics and the political discussions at all. But what this Immigration Reform Act was it made the hiring of illegal immigrants, and I know there's been, especially after the State of the Union, if you've been aware of that, all kinds of hullabaloo about President Biden's use of the word illegal. And illegal, we don't want to say that people are illegal, but that is a very new approach, undocumented. Okay, but in 1986, that was not a problem because it was simply a legal definition of people who were in the country illegally. That was a way of saying we are going to, if you hire someone who does not have the proper papers, who is not here legally, we're going to make that illegally and you can be fined. That applies to the agricultural labor. It applied to, especially in the clothing industry, in the textile industry, the fashion industry, who were hiring a lot of undocumented workers, and in the restaurant industry. And all of a sudden for employers, it was a problem. Because how do we do this? How do we kind of deal with this now that it's actually illegal to hire illegal aliens? Illegal aliens means, again, you could say that's a bad term. It is a legally defined term. So undocumented individuals who do not have the legal status of permanent residence, permanent residency. But what then it also did was saying, okay, we know that's a problem, but those people who are here already, we're not going to deport them. We are going to legalize them. And the Immigration Reform Act of 1968 legalized illegal immigrants or non-documented workers, let's say, who have arrived prior to 1982. And there were approximately, and it's always hard to count, 2.7 million people who became then legal in the sense of registering for a path to citizenship, so that they were no longer legally categorized as illegal, but as legal residents having opportunities to become citizens. So that was what Reagan's approach was doing in terms of the labor force and immigration in the context then too of his what's been called Reaganomics, supply side approach and the trickle down effect to address some of the economic problems and issues that the country was facing. And in so many ways it actually worked. But on the political side, we can talk about the Reagan doctrine. Not simply about Reaganomics, but we can talk about the Reagan doctrine. Obviously, this goes together on the international scale. And that was to counter almost the Brezhnev doctrine, to have this forceful opposition to the Soviet Union, and not only for containment, which was the Truman Doctrine, but really to roll it back. And that led, as I already mentioned, to the arms race. It also led to the U.S. taking active measures to prevent further Soviet influence. Now, we've already talked about the Korean War. We talked about losing China, so to speak, after the Chinese Civil War, directly after World War II. We talked about Korea. We talked about Vietnam. All wars based on attempting to counter the Soviet Union, none of which were actually all that effective. And so that was the issue of, okay, we'll kind of step back from that, especially after the Vietnam, which was seen as a complete disaster for the U.S. And yet Reagan said, okay, we're going to stop. Now, what we're going to do is, again, take new military action to prevent the increasing encroachment of Soviet influence. And so what they did is they invaded the island of Grenada. In October 25th, 1983. The island of Grenada which we can see here on the map. On the next slide, the map is a small little island off the coast of Venezuela. You can see that if you look at this map, the Caribbean Sea, you see probably clearly Cuba, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. You see there in South America and Venezuela. If you go up, so this is on the lower south, on the right, the lower right quadrant. South America, you go up and a little bit to the right is the Grenada. So you can just see this is not a major place. This is not even like Cuba. If you go and look back at Cuba, it's not like Jamaica. It is a very small island. But the government had voted in Soviet influences, and that led to the U.S. saying this is getting, again, too close to our home. So we're not going to allow that. So they invade Grenada and they get rid of the established government and set up a new government. They overthrow the communist government and they set up a pro-U.S. government. And this led to widespread condemnation. And the UN General Assembly, in Resolution 38/7, November 2nd, 1983, by an overwhelming vote of 108-9, stated that the UN deeply deplores the armed intervention in Grenada, which constitutes a flagrant violation of international law and of the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of that state, end quote. I mean, it was here for the first time, I think. I can't say that for sure that it was the first time, but very strong condemnation of U.S. action by the international community in the UN, which the U.S. had set up originally itself in the aftermath of World War II. And so how did Reagan respond? His kind of famous quote said, well, it didn't upset my breakfast at all, meaning he couldn't care. And this is really the beginning of the U.S. launching into a policy of we are going to go our own way. It's almost a shift in the concept of American exceptionalism. I don't know if you've heard that term, but the idea of American exceptionalism is that the U.S., is different. We're different from all the other countries in the world. We're special. Almost better. And we can do things other countries can't. And with this, it's almost like saying, okay, we had set up this international order based on international law, but we're not going to follow it. We're only going to use it when it is in our best interest. And when it's not in our best interest, we're going to ignore it. That's almost, a blatant hypocritical position. But this focus then on the U.S., kind of U.S. first, we don't have to be subject to international law, even though all the other countries do, because we're exceptional. And so we can do this. So there was no real effect of Reagan's attempt to limit Soviet influence in Grenada. But that then was shortly followed by the Iran-Contra affair, which was a clandestine secret program, because in Nicaragua, go back on the map, you can see where Nicaragua is down there too. Nicaragua in Central America. There were issues of Soviet influence in a number of South American countries, socialist Soviet influences. And this was really worrisome to Reagan, the Reagan doctrine, because what we have of Cuba and the Cuban Missile Crisis, we don't want it to get to that point again, so we're going to try to nip it in the bud as much as we possibly can. The problem is we can't let people know, the country know, that we're doing this, especially after Grenada, because it's kind of almost too controversial. So we're going to do it clandestinely. What we're going to do is not have resolutions in Congress to support the Contras in Nicaragua, which were the pro-Western factions fighting the pro-Soviet government. They're the revolutionaries trying to overthrow the government of Nicaragua, which was, with Soviet influence and help, a socialist communist government. So we're going to help them, but we can't let people know we're helping them, and we can't really have Senate appropriations for these things. So we're going to use arms sales to Iran as a means of funding our operations to support the revolutionaries, or as they began to be known, the quote-unquote freedom fighters. It depends on your perspective. Revolutionary, freedom fighters. The freedom fighters in Nicaragua were trying to overthrow their government, and on we go. And when this came out, when this scheme came out, it was an international scandal, and it was a domestic scandal as well. And there were resignations within the administration and convictions. Oliver North, is a name you might know, as a general who was kind of behind it all. And he kind of was the fall guy. So Reagan didn't really suffer much. There was some image damage, or damage to his image in terms of his administration and what was going on. But he himself was pretty much unscathed by it. Was it legal? Not by international law, but it was something that they did because they were, again, trying to oppose Soviet influence. And that Reagan doctrine led to these kind of debacles of Grenada and Nicaragua, and still wherever that then later developed. And yet his overall position of opposing and strongly opposing the Soviets, and this was still in the context of the Cold War, strongly opposing the Soviets, and not just to containment, but to try to roll back Soviet influence, in opposition with the Brezhnev doctrine of saying, get out of our domestic policies and influences, leave us alone, and to expand their influence, was a real conflict. And this conflict actually led to the end of the Cold War. But that is something I'll be talking more about in the next lecture. But Reagan has received, and rightly so, credit for policies, right or wrong, that led to the ending of the Cold War and the eventual disintegration of the Soviet Union. Again, that will be the topic for next lecture. But here, this whole period, let's say, of the 1980s, which means, again, the long 1980s we can refer to as the Reagan era. Obviously, the 1970s was not. Ronald Reagan was governor of California in the 1960s. And then, so he was 1950s Hollywood star, especially with Westerns, and then he gets into politics, becomes governor of California, and then runs for the presidency. The Reagan era. So he is elected in 1980. He's reelected in 84. And he was seen as this great figure who ended up ending the Cold War, who brought back prosperity to the United States. In some ways, Europe following along, but not in the same way, and led to a new confidence in the superiority of the West, led by the U.S., in the face of the East, so to speak, in Russia, and a Soviet socialist communist position. And that, if a period of the Reagan era and the new conservatism, was broader than simply the U.S., even though it became kind of the model, not completely, but that was with the U.S. being the leader of the West. We're talking more about that again next week, but not exclusively so. But with Thatcher in the UK and Reagan in the US, we have this new conservatism. Now I have it there too on the last slide, the new progressivism, because there's always been a reaction. And that reaction was by progressives saying we have to counter this. This is not allowed. Now, that movement was rather small at the time, because Reagan was, as I said, successful. It led to, again, in terms of the Reaganomics, a new materialism, whereby this focus on me. Am I better off? If I'm not, I better take steps so I can be better off. And how is that measured? By income, by wealth, by what I have and what I own. And the 1980s was this period of materialistic flourishing. Again, not that the United States had not always been materialistic in so many ways, but compared to, again, Kennedy's statements, don't ask what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. With Reagan and with the materialism of the 80s, it was completely shifted to what can my country do for me? What can the government do for me? Well, they can cut my taxes. We can make it more possible for me to be wealthy. And if I'm not already wealthy, I aspire to being wealthy. So that is where some of these dynamics come about, and it gets to be kind of some ways messed up depending on your position. But we had then the rise of what became known as the yuppies, the young up-and-coming professionals is what it stands for, who felt that their material goods, their material life, had to demonstrate and flaunt their material wealth, whether they actually had it or not. So there is an expansion of credit. There is almost a disregard. It's almost a little bit going back to the 1920s before the crash, a little bit. But it was the sense that my value and my well-being is measured by my wealth and my material possessions. This, too, was focused on a policy with Reagan of America first, in the individual, because it was like, okay, America, the United States, is an individual country. So therefore, we're looking at ourselves, this America first, that then led to the rejection of and ignoring of international law and UN resolutions as if they applied to the U.S. that they didn't agree with. And for the individual, what benefits me? What benefits me? What do I want? What do I think? What do I feel like? So in some ways, this individualism applies both to the individual people and to an America First policy as such. And yet, especially in the 80s, it was successful. The return of quote-unquote prosperity. Because the 70s, as I pointed out, was a depressed period. But in the 80s, that new hope of coming out of the had been called the Great Recession to new forms of developing wealth worked in aggregate. If we look at the economic factors overall, GDP, disposable income, all those factors of the economy were getting a lot better. So there was a huge recovery based on the stimulus of the tax breaks, but that also led to an increasing gap between the wealthy and the poor, whereby the middle class was really getting stretched and increasingly in danger of disappearing because the wealthy were getting much wealthier. And for the aggregate, that is a good. But for the health of the people, was it? That's a debate we're still having. Because the wealthy were getting wealthier, then the poor were getting poorer. And yet, if you're poor, percentage-wise, if you decline, that is of greater significance, percentage-wise, to you than if you're wealthy and you have a percentage increase. So if let's say you're making $1 million a year, and if you get an increase to $1.2 million a year, that's going to make things all over great. But if you're making, $15,000 a year, and you have a decrease to $12,000 a year, that's going to hurt you more. So that gap was increasingly spreading and spreading and spreading based on the tax cuts for the wealthy and the corporations. That, looking back, was like, what's going on there? How do we deal with that problem and situation? And it's one that we still have. And yet, again, I said it's not without tensions and problems, always looking back. Hindsight is 20/20. But it was successful at the time to deal with the problems. And this all, in the whole Reagan doctrine and the Reagan era, as I already said, led to the victory, so to speak, of the West within the Cold War, which just simply seemed to underscore the validity and the rightness of Reaganism at the time. It worked, and the West emerged victorious. That's what we'll be talking about in the next lecture, in terms of the end of the Cold War and what was to come thereafter, and what does that all mean, because all of a sudden it's like, now what do we do? It ends in, depending on how you date it, let's say by 1991 anyway, with a new order, because the Cold War, the conflict between the Soviets and the West, the U.S. and Europe, but with the U.S. leading, had been the model since the end of World War II. When we get, let's talk about it next lecture. Then what? Now what? Now how do we handle the situation when the Soviets are no longer the Soviets? The Soviet Union is dismantled and disbanded. That's the question. And we'll be talking about that next lecture. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.